Thanks very much, Greg. And in fact, let's give a hand for all four of these guys. These are pretty amazing stories and amazing messages, so really appreciate that. Wow. Where to start? Such interesting stuff. I have a couple of questions, so start thinking about what you all want to ask, and we'll go through this. If you have we have a recording in the back, so speak up when you do. So kind of a couple things just to kind of start the ball rolling. First, y'all were trained for contingencies in your lives as pilots, just as you have been trained more specifically as astronauts or for different things. Kind of compare and contrast, if you would, how do they carry over, or was it a whole different language or a whole different world as you applied aeronautical type contingency drills to space? So why don't we start with you, Bob?
Well, it's similar in the fact that you go through simulations, and when you're flying airplanes also, we don't have that many, at least we didn't when I was doing that many sophisticated simulations, but you would practice things breaking, knowing how to respond to them, using checklist. The spacecraft is that probably tenfold more, but it does give you the kind of mental thinking to deal with them. You know, one of the significant contingencies we have is Neil, back on the Gemini, I forget the number now, but he and Dave Scott were flying, and they had just docked with an Agena, and they ended up starting to rotate, thinking it was the Agena, broke away from it, still rotating, and Neil Armstrong went to the backup controls that they would normally use for entry and solved it. It wasn't something he had trained for, but the fact that he was, a pilot with extensive experience allowed him to react and do it. And I recently sat on a panel with the National Research Council, and that was one of the points that I tried to emphasize, that we need lots of scientists flying in space, but with the kind of vehicles we're going to be flying, even if they're more automated, people with flying experience is something good to have.
Just to add one other thought, when you do training, if you're sitting in a chair and you're dealing with things and flipping switches and there's no consequences to that other than you get chewed out or you get a bad grade or whatever, it isn't as valuable as the kind of training where you really scare the crap out of yourself. And to be blunt, in the Navy, for example, we do firefighting training in real fires inside a compartment that's filled with smoke and fire, and you've got to put it out. In NASA, we had T-38s that we used for training people who had not had much aviation experience in cockpit resource management, coordination, and then dealing with being in an airplane that needed the right kind of response when you had a problem, or even when you didn't, but you had to work together to get it on the ground safely. That transferred directly into the way we operated in the shuttle. And when I got to NASA in '84, and by the way, Crip and Dan were mentors of mine, and Dan was the chief of the astronaut office that assigned me to my first mission. Thank you very much. But that kind of transfer from the pilots to the mission specialists, particularly early in the shuttle program, I think was critical to forming how the crews operated together and reacted to emergencies.
Good. Thanks. Dan, anything do you want to add, or Greg?
I don't. Well, there was one thing, and it kind of builds on what Frank said. Is he mentioned I was chief of all. One thing he really tried to impress me, because a lot of times training in the simulator, as Greg mentioned, they throw you scads of failures, and I always referred to it as told the crew, don't get the sim mentality, because you just trying to keep up with it, you just be flipping switches without. I said, in flight, you really want to, before you flip a switch, you want to look and make sure you've got the right switch and the like. And that was kind of in my mind, one of the negatives of some of the training. I still think it was good because we got really worked over, but it could develop you could develop some bad habits if you weren't careful.
Okay, great.
And I think the question has been well covered, but what occurs to me is the importance of communication. And as we trained, we were able to not only communicate verbally but non-verbally with our fellow crew members, and that made us more efficient. And then also the importance of a very well-articulated message, very short, concise message when speaking with the Mission Control Center. And so polishing those communication skills is critical to the safety of spaceflight, and it's a good analogy for when we have or it's a good capability that would be necessary when we don't have the ability to talk to mission control real time, when we're going outside of low Earth orbit and we're going further away to the moon or Mars or a near Earth asteroid, the capability to not necessarily rely on the real time communication with the ground, so the communication within crew members becomes more important.
And just to foot stomp that a little bit and maybe bring together some of the thoughts, I didn't notice him over there earlier because he's in such an incognito shirt. And that red shirt over there is Rob Kelso, who was flight director on STS-51 when we were dealing with those problems. And Rob and his team were a great example of how important it is to learn to work correctly with the ground. And both these guys touched on it. And you do your simulations working with the ground team and learning how to communicate with them. And for people who have not had much experience in aviation, you have to learn how to communicate with the ground and when to rely on them and when to figure out that they don't know what they're talking about. But you have to be able to talk to them, and you've got to have a good, solid team where you know each other really well between the cockpit and the ground.
Okay, very good. We talked a lot about simulations, and I'm just kind of curious. We heard about some simulations that were not quite like the real thing when you got there, and others that apparently worked like clockwork. How do you train knowing that it may not be what you're training on? In other words, the sim may not match the real thing, and you know that. So how do you train for that? How do you factor that in?
The way I learned about that was listening to the debriefs from the crews ahead of me, and they usually did a very good job of telling you what was like the sim and what was not. What to expect and what to be ready for, and that's one of the ways you learn what the lack of fidelity might be. And the other thing is, generally in the shuttle program, we had enough assets and enough analysis to tell us what was flight-like and what might not be, and actually most of it was pretty flight-like. In fact, the good thing was the shuttle was actually easier to fly than the shuttle training aircraft, and if it had been the other way around, we might have had some more interesting missions and landings.
Anyone else have a thought on that question? No, that's okay. I was asked to ask this. I'm a little red-faced to ask it, but the movie Gravity.
Okay, let me stick my neck out here. I loved the movie, and I know that I probably am not in the majority of the guys who'd flown in space, but I loved the movie. Not for anything realistic about the movie, but a couple things spoke to me. One was the relationship between the pilot/commander and the mission specialist. And if you look at the movie and you recognize the relationship between George Clooney and Sandra Bullock, and she was so focused on what she was trying to do, and he was alerting her to the bigger picture. And up here you have all shuttle commanders, former shuttle commanders up here, and they're paid to have the big picture. And so I thought it was very interesting that the director had captured that relationship. The other thing that spoke out to me to the movie were the beautiful visuals.
You mean Sandra?
No, not Sandra. And not George. But I got 32 days in space, and it was just beautiful looking at our planet from space. The cupola was an amazing module that was added. It wasn't up there the first time I went up, and then I didn't really have the understanding or respect of how important that beautiful bay window that we have on the space station is. But looking at our beautiful planet and the opening of the movie, I was hooked with Hello when it was that essence of floating in space, looking at our beautiful planet, and orbiting the Earth. It just, you got to do it for a pretty long period of time. I'm very jealous of you. But I liked it. Okay, I admit everything's not lined up. We're not in the same orbits. Was the Soyuz mock-up, I understand, was pretty realistic, but yeah, there wasn't a lot of realistic plot going on, but I think they captured a lot of interesting points in the movie.
Yeah, we really don't practice flying around with the fire extinguisher.
Very good. Very awesome.
Aren't you guys getting hit on the movie? Come on. Everybody knows why nobody likes it.
Well, I liked it, but you know, it was a movie. It didn't have much reality in it, but I thought that they did a good job of simulating being weightless. You know, Sandra's hair didn't float out like it normally would for most females that fly in zero-G. We certainly don't have the Hubble Space Telescope and the Chinese station and our station all in the same orbit, so there's no way you can get to them. And you know, people slinging off and going here. I mean, that's not realistic, but it was a movie. If you enjoy movies, you and take it in that aspect. It was good. You want to see something that's realistic? Go see Apollo 13.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it also.
Thanks, Dan.
So
Well,
it's okay to enjoy.
Sure.
I just got two comments. One is, none of the people I saw get in or out of spacesuits wore liquid cooling garments that looked like hers.
I admired her.
Yeah. And the second thing is, I did live on the station, and I saw this movie in IMAX 3D, which was probably a mistake, because for me it was basically every nightmare I'd ever had about spaceflight occurring about every 30 seconds. And they had to drag me out at the end.
Awesome. Thanks. We had a teaser about you and John Young talking about RTLS for STS-1, and I'm just curious if you can share a little bit more about that.
Well, that was discussed, but not very seriously. You know, everybody recognized RTLS, especially since we didn't have the automation that Box mentioned in there for the early flights. So it wasn't something you wanted to go try and do. We did talk about, you know, an abort once around where we don't spend a long time on orbit. We considered all those. Truthfully, you know, and I'm dumb, I know this, but, you know, they wanted to declare the shuttle operational after the fourth flight. And I didn't think that we should, since we had never proven that we could fly an RTLS. So I volunteered to go fly an RTLS after the initial flights, but everybody thought I was dumb, and so that never happened either.
Very good. Okay, thanks. Okay, at this point, I want to open it up to audience questions. So go ahead.
About Kirkland there. I was at Rockwell during the 1974 to 98 timeframe, so I got in on at least scope of all the things that were going on then. And I remember one thing about Skylab. I think it was Skylab 2 or 3, I don't remember which, where the two crew members decided to go jogging in the oxygen tanker or the storage tank. And mission control got very unhappy with them. Do you have any background on that one?
That was done by actually, I think, almost all three crews. They would, in the workshop, we had a lot of storage lockers because we had to launch it with everything that was going to be there for all the three missions. And the guys found that if they started off slow, they could end up with enough centrifugal force to actually physically run around those tanks. And but it did tend to drive the control moment gyros that were trying to hold the attitude. so we had to be careful as to when they did it, but it only received mild criticism, I think.
Okay, thanks. Thanks. Yes, sir.
Thanks for all you did.
Only if I could drive.
But don't ask my wife that question.
Okay, right up front.
Great presentation, and maybe it may not be a fair question for you all, but we're getting ready to go into an era of new vehicles, and it's being developed now, and we've got standards to meet and fill on paper. How does your experience, with vehicles you described, set us up for the kind of expectations we should have, or what kind of expectations should we have on any new vehicle? Not a specific design or specific company in this case, but any new vehicle in terms of the kind of instant problems that Greg alluded to with Endeavor and so on, that weren't, that you didn't experience as much as you might have expected. Because a lot of this is going to be paid for by tax money and knowing Congress and this ways, they're going to look askance at problems unless they have a realistic understanding of what to expect. So how do we set expectations properly of what you think they should be?
If I could say something first, Jeff used to work on Capitol Hill. I don't know when he was ever constrained by asking a fair question. But in brief, I think we should expect problems during early flights. Whether they occur or not is something else, but we should expect them. We should be prepared to deal with them, prepared to recover from them possibly if they're really serious. But not only should the people operating them be prepared for them, but the people who are paying for them, the constituents, and the American public should be prepared for problems and be able to deal with them, and they should be explainable in a way that it makes sense. This is high technology, this is high risk, and sometimes things happen and you need to keep going or give up. And I don't think we should give up on spaceflight.
I'd like to emphasize that as well. I'm afraid as a nation, we probably have gotten really risk adverse. We went through 2 terrible accidents with the shuttle. But flying in space, especially if we go beyond low Earth orbit, is dangerous. We can strive to reduce that as best we can, but it's never going to be perfect. So planning for and expecting that it might happen, and knowing that when it does, that you have to just pick yourself up by your bootstraps and continue on. And I guess that gives me a segue to something as I was listening to the presentations that I wanted to go back and at least touch on, especially for those that are involved in building vehicles. I guess I didn't say it, but when Peaky was trying to capture that Solar Max satellite and the trunnion, and he couldn't do it, it was that the trunnion was not in the configuration of the drawings that we had used to design the capture feature. Both Dan and Frank mentioned about where we got screw-ups between what the vehicle was actually, how it was wired, designed, didn't match drawings. So as we build new vehicles, having configuration control and quality control is extremely important and needs to have a line drawn in it, because even though we've been doing this business for a long time, we still run into problems. And I doubt if we're going to eliminate them, but we should strive to do so.
To expand on what Crip was talking about, we are getting more sophisticated and we are better understanding the problems. But it's the unknown unknowns that we have to plan for. And automation is great, and automation can save your life in a situation. But your automation is only as good as what you know and what you program. And so I think flight test is important. And I don't want us to lose sight of the importance of flight test and having an out, not just relying on automation.
I guess my only comment was to reinforce what Cripps said. One of my biggest concerns is the society's aversion to risk. we'd have never, in my mind, we'd have never launched STS-1 with the state of the risk aversion that we had around when the shuttle program ended. And, Lewis and Clark would have never made it to the West Coast and whatnot. I think that most of us that have been test pilots and take on a job like this are willing to accept a certain amount of risk. And, you certainly want the team working to reduce the risk, but you can't run it to zero. And if you want to explore and do things, by golly, you're going to have to accept some risk, and you ought to sign people up that are willing to accept it and go do it.
Very good. Okay, other questions?
Just add to Crimp's story, I think that highlights 41C. I was in the control center while Crimp was asleep, the cruise sleep, after Pinky tried to attach to the trunnion pin, and the spacecraft began wobbling. Well, when the crew was asleep, the wobble was such that the solar rays, the solar max, could not capture enough sunlight to recharge the batteries in the sunlight portion of each pass. And of course, we weren't using the tracking data relay site or satellite. We were using 6 or 7 ground stations to communicate with the satellite. We'd already gone through turning everything off in that spacecraft we could. But each pass, we were going deeper and deeper into the batteries. And that last pass, we got one station contact, and it was really questionable whether the batteries would survive until we got into the sunlight. And sure enough, we got into the sunlight over a ground station in the next pass, and the spacecraft had just come through where it was in a position where it could see the sun, and the torque rods had stabilized it enough where now it began to resupply the batteries. But we came so close to losing that spacecraft over the night period, and then with the stabilized, Crip was able to come and grab it the next day. But it just re-emphasized, this notion that Murphy really lives in space. And you can see it. And it happened to me all the time as it happened to you guys. And the wrong part of the orbit, too, as a matter of fact.
Usually.
But, it's through that training that we're able to do risk versus risk and risk versus gain when Murphy does strike when we don't expect it.
Very good. Other questions? Oh,
front.
go ahead, sir.
There's a lot of discussion about Columbia and a day 2 incident would have been detected early. The crew may be here today. What's your view on whether or not we can drop that crew back?
Well, in fact, that was looked at by the accident investigation, and it's questionable. They did not take advantage of some of the DoD sources that were available to them, similar to what we'd used on Skylab, only a lot better now. If they had done that, and because that was talked about, but it was decided not to do it, they would have probably have discovered the hole that was in the leading edge of the wing. And the vehicle was not survivable with that, so then what do? It turned out that we had another shuttle that was pretty close to launch, and it would have been a yeoman's job to go launch it, and we would have had to launch it without being really sure that the problem was corrected, that it caused the Columbia problem, but that's a risk. And there was some mentality was that, well, there's no sense going to look at it because there's nothing we can do about it. And, NASA is at its best when it's got a contingency to deal with. I mentioned Apollo 13 a while ago. That's a prime example of where they did that. What they did to save Skylab, even though it wasn't something that they knew how to do, they did it. So I wish we'd at least looked at it and understood it. Whether it would have been successful, I don't know. There is no way of knowing that.
We'd have given it a hell of a try, though.
Right.
In the very back?
There's discussion that in a mission to Mars, that the amount of radiation exposure to the astronauts in such a mission would exceed the current limits. And yet there's discussion about possibly making a sort of an ethical exception for especially, very important
So the question is, are there cases we could envision where we would go beyond allowable radiation limits for crew? In other words, it kind of intentionally expose them to danger?
Or other sorts of risks.
Okay, or other sorts of risks.
I have an opinion on that, surprisingly, right? The risk of a mission to Mars in itself is going to be extremely high, and radiation will be a part of it. And you will have to go on that mission knowing that you're at risk for a number of things beyond just radiation that you're not going to normally experience in even a low Earth orbit space flight. So the crew is going to have to go fully informed of what the risks are, just as we did on shuttle flights, but nowhere near as high as that probably. Though ascent is a very risky time, and the numbers aren't all that good, really. We did well because people worked really hard at it to manage that risk. But a trip to the far side of the moon, a trip to Mars, is going to carry high risk, largely because of the amount of time you're going to be in space, and you're not going to be able to mitigate some of these things. And if it goes wrong, you're not going to be able to just turn around and come back. I've been talking to the medical folks over the last couple of years during my annual physicals about this, and they actually are fairly optimistic that there are things they can do to mitigate that risk, much more so than they thought a couple of years ago. A combination of shielding, spacecraft design, and also pharmaceuticals that they can use that would reduce the crew's risk to cancer as a result of radiation. So people are working it very hard. But your basic question is, should we allow a crew to go if there's an elevated risk of exposure to radiation and the consequences of that? I think if you inform the crew fully of it and don't hide anything, and they're able to make the choice, I think we ought to allow them to do that. But definitely don't hide anything, and don't pretend that there's not risk, and don't pretend to the people who manage these things or pay for them that there's not risk. You have to go in with your eyes open.
The limits that they use on radiation are very conservative,
Yeah.
and you could certainly take higher doses and still probably be okay. So, but I agree with Frank altogether that to having some level of higher risk, because it's just one factor of the risk that you're talking about, is something that should be considered. Now, what we really ought to do is develop a propulsion system that's going to allow us to get there in a short period of time, so we mitigate that.
That's, no, other questions? Carl, you already had one. Let's get it with the guy in the back. Sorry, the lady. The lady.
There's a number of types of missions that are being discussed for future manned space flight, such as the far side of the moon, an asteroid, or Mars. Which do you prefer?
So the question is, out of the options on the table, lunar, Mars, asteroid, what do y'all prefer?
Do we have to pick one?
Which do you prefer first?
I think what I'd like to see them do first is get a plan, set some goals, and then take the steps to get to it. Ultimately, I think, going to Mars would be something to expand human exploration, would be the thing to do. And how do you best get there? My opinion is go to the moon first, and because you're only going 3 days, and you can develop most of the procedures and most of the equipment on a three-day trip where you can get back reasonably easy, relatively speaking, and then proceed from there. But I'm not king for a day. I'm retired now.
I concur.
I agree with Dan. We have the technology now, a lot of it on the space station itself, to go to the moon and either stay in orbit around it or live on the surface of the moon using what we have basically in space now. In fact, when I lived on the station, about halfway through, I started thinking, I could, with a little more propulsion, I could take this and if I had a little more water and food, I could just go to the moon and set it down. But basically, that is the way to learn how to operate, and that's typically what we do, is a build-up approach where you expose yourselves to more and more risk as you go, develop procedures, learn what the problems are that you haven't solved yet, and then go further and further out. And I think a step-by-step approach with a plan that's well-defined will work well. I'm not sure why
all of these guys.
Yeah. I'm not sure where the asteroid fits in there, but I'm sure it does somewhere.
Very good. Okay, Carl, you had one on deck.
I can't see behind this, I don't know if it's N0. But a few minutes ago, we were talking about
Columbia.
particularly after Columbia. I guess Mr. Brendan's sign, if the Inmarsat situation had arisen during the latter part of the program, you think we would have gotten approval to send 3 astronauts out in the payload bay to gravity by hand?
So the question's for Dan. I'm repeating it for the video. The question is, given increasing levels of risk aversion in the later stages of the shuttle program, would we have done the kind of commercial satellite rescues that we did in the early part of the program?
I would certainly hope so. I don't know. I think I mentioned that, somewhat jokingly, but I think if, before we ever left on this mission, we'd have suggested doing it the way we did, we'd have probably had a heck of a time selling it. But, and another thing, that particular mission, it was the first time for the new administrator. And so, he was getting exposed to NASA at his best, but I wasn't on the ground, but I heard some stories that he didn't view it that way. But, but it happened. And I think, once again, we launched towards the end, closer to the end of the program, and the need arose during orbit and it could be solved, the mission could be completed successfully. I think it would have probably been a sell, because the team on the ground, they are good, and if they recognize it as a reasonable capability with not undue risk, that they would have supported it, and as they did in this case even, and push it hard. And yeah, sometimes you still end up with a manager that won't go along, but generally they can be coerced by a big enough consensus from the people that really know what's going on.
Carl, I think there's 2 parts to your question. One is, would a mission like that have been sold? Would we have had approval to go do a mission like that for a commercial satellite later in the program? Part of the consequence of Challenger was we didn't do very many commercial activities after that. And the real question was, should you risk crew for those types of endeavors, or for rescuing a satellite necessarily? Now, we did rescue a few, but it became fewer and fewer as we went through. The other part of it is, if you had a mission that was rescuing a satellite or doing anything really, and a problem occurred during the mission, you would throw everything at it, including the kitchen sink, to solve it generally. And I saw that over and over. To me, what I saw with payload developers, for example, was if they had a design flaw, and they had to spend millions of dollars on it, if they could get it through the system and get it on orbit, NASA would spend millions of dollars on solving that problem for them, and it would probably be successful, but you couldn't get it pre-flight. So, I mean, it's a can-do agency and a can-do community. Our aerospace community is can-do, and we like to solve problems, and that's, again, the fun part of the job. So, Sam.
Yeah,
Sorry, Tony.
It's kind of great for all the shuttle experiences, and which I was part of earlier in my career. But on Space Station Assembly, we went through a lot of problems.
No, it's perfect.
And we took a lot of risks on the things we've done in EVA and IDA. I'd like to see this panel maybe next year do a panel on the station.
Contingencies, that would be good.
Well, the solar array failed deploy. That was a perfect example. And sure would like to have had a 3D printer on board.
Well played.
Well, the shuttle program's over, so we're protecting the innocent here. So,
Okay. Yes, sir.
International partnerships are great, and there's a lot of countries that are gaining a lot of expertise in space that we enjoyed early on in today's our program. Not having a plan to go really far forward in the future, is it really going to take impetus of Chinese landing on the moon to really give us the motivation to create a plan to go and do some hard things that we were motivated here in this room to become part of this industry to support you all in your endeavors?
So the question is, what's it going to take to motivate the nation to get back into the hardcore exploration that we did earlier?
if we knew the answer to that, we'd be on our way to the moon.
Right. There's no way to say it. But I will say, really, exploration, due to its expense and complexity, should be an international endeavor like the International Space Station. And I'm one of the ones that believe that we ought to be approaching the Chinese to be part of that as well, because it's obviously they have a space program and they're well-driven. You do that recognizing the risk of trying to transfer knowledge, but we did that with the Russians, and I think it worked out very well for us.
Okay, right here.
Wondering what the panel's thoughts are on the commercialized human space flight, like companies like SpaceX getting into the human space flight aspect, and how that might enable us to further our human space flight exploration.
So the question is, how does the panel feel about the commercial crew program?
I should probably recuse myself.
Well, more power to them. I think it's a worthwhile thing. I was, when we started COTS for resupply, I thought we ought to be cautious about doing that, but it's turned out both SpaceX and Orbital have proven they can do that. We have at least 3 companies that I believe on the commercial side to carry crew have made some very positive progress. Right now, we got SpaceX, we got Boeing, and we've got Sierra Nevada that I know, and there's maybe another company or so that's trying to get in there. I guess NASA hopefully is going to down select. Hopefully they'll keep two in, but I think it's a good thing. NASA should be focused on exploration. That means going beyond low Earth orbit, and if we can transfer some of this stuff to commercial entities with the correct amount of safety, then I think it's the right thing to do.
And,
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
and just to add a little more, I think there's some that aren't there to support NASA, but like Space Galactica, no, Virgin Galactic, and a variety of those that once again would generate interest in the country, and hopefully that would also have an influence on more support for exploration.
First of all, it's a real privilege to be a part of one of the companies that's doing cargo delivery, which is important for the continuation of the station. But you ask about human spaceflight. Now, we do have Larry Price and his team working really hard on Orion, so that we will have crew transportation beyond low Earth orbit. But the access to the space station, whether we all like it or not, or whether we all agree with the decisions that were made early on, because of risk aversion and cost, the shuttle was discontinued before it was really obsolete. It could have continued to fly at some expense and with some addressing of risk problems. But the decision was made by the various administrations that we're going to go to commercial providers for crew in addition to cargo. Again, I think it's very important that it's done carefully with sufficient input from NASA for crew safety and for reliability. And that's going to be the big challenge for commercial providers, particularly doing something on a fixed price basis. So the next couple of years are going to be critical for determining whether the U.S. will have homegrown access to space or not, or we're going to continue to rely on our international partners. So I think it's time for all of us to get on board and say, yes, we do support this, because this is our system for getting people into Earth. And being able to fly people to the station will enable us to go beyond low Earth orbit and go to the moon or Mars via Orion and its successors. But we all need to support that, whether we agree with the original decisions or not. That's the way we're marching. And they're pretty far down the road. And it's important that it be done right. And when they need help, we ought to give them help.
Okay. I have a question for Dan. Can you tell us a little bit about the Astronaut Scholarship Foundation? Who is your sponsor today for this panel?
Right, well, thank you. Yes, I'm honored to be the chairman of the Astronaut Scholarship Foundation, which has sponsored this session. It was formed 30 years ago by the original 7 astronauts, and since the formation, there have been 350 scholars that have received the scholarships. They're based on merit, given to juniors and seniors in science and technology fields, based on recommendations from our affiliated universities that we work with, and they have all gone on to be very successful. In fact, the organizer of this session, Jarrett LaFleur, in the back, organized the session. He is one of our scholars. We're also very proud that the last astronaut selection had the first astronaut scholar to be selected as an astronaut. And so it's been, you know, we're looking to grow very much. We have a new executive director, Tammy Knowles, and we last several years have been giving 28 scholarships. This year we're bumping it up to 32, going to 35 the following year, and our goal is to get up to 60 as soon as we can. So it's
$10,000 each.
yeah, each scholarship is $10,000, and we get a lot of positive feedback from the scholars that have received them. And what also is very encouraging that the scholars are giving back. They're sponsoring scholars, you know, a scholarship themselves. So it's been a very good organization, and we hope to continue it because this country needs sharp science and technology researchers and innovators in the future. Thanks.
Very good. I'd like to thank the foundation for sponsoring. Bob, you wanted to say something? Okay, there, so a question towards the back.
Is there a difference in the way the cosmonauts are trained to respond to emergencies and problem solve as compared to NASA astronauts?
The question is, are Russian cosmonauts trained differently to respond to contingencies than U.S. astronauts?
I would say in the early days, they were trained somewhat differently. Their whole training philosophy is different than ours in terms of rote memorization and versus simulation, and their approach to clearing crews for flight, for example, it's much more of like going through defending your thesis, for example, or final exams. And if you stumble, you don't fly. In the U.S., if people stumble, we tend to retrain them and make sure they're ready to go. We do make sure they're ready to go, but it's not quite as draconian as pulling them from a crew, except on very unusual circumstances. So they had a lot more pressure on them to perform and not make any mistakes. And the other thing that is different, and still continues to be to a certain extent, is the Rob left, but I think the ground does track our mistakes on orbit, but they don't make a huge deal of it unless you know, really are off the scale. But the Russians officially track mistakes people make on orbit, large or small, and when you come back for your debrief, they put a big chart up there with your name on it to tell you how many mistakes you made. And their payment system for flight is based somewhat on the number of mistakes they made. So it's somewhat of a different approach. So that will affect how you respond to emergencies in terms of whether you have the courage to go out and do what you need to do, or if you're afraid you're going to make a mistake and you hang back. So there are some differences in philosophy there. Nowadays, it's a little bit more uniform because we do train together and fly together. At least it was in the middle of the program. I think we've started to diverge more because the Russian segment and the U.S. segment are operated much more independently than they were a few years ago. So we may be diverging in training philosophy there.
Others questions, or? Okay, Carl.
Okay.
Nope, you got it.
Thanks for behind yourself. My question is sort of centered on food on board.
Time.
And especially with the latest in the station, has the food prep and storage and taste and attractiveness improved over the years? Yes, but how much?
Immensely, in my opinion. I mean, the early days of prior to shuttle, I mean, Crip knows this better than I do, what they had on Skylab and Apollo. Some of it was, I think, kind of challenging, I guess, way to put it. But and storage, of course, was a problem also. I mean, we didn't have the kind of processing in those days we do now. Irradiation, freeze drying has made a big difference in what we can carry. On the early days of the shuttle, we had a lot of freeze-dried food. On the station, we now have MREs, many of which are irradiated. You can get a steak on board that all you have to do is warm it up. I think the food system has advanced a long way, and they spend a lot of time working that. We have Russian food, U.S. food, international food, and you can kind of mix and match. I actually eventually gained weight on orbit, so I guess it was pretty good. And most of it was fairly appealing, and you do get the opportunity to test it on the ground. So I think we've come a long way in being able to provide food for crews that are going to travel long distances, because most of it will survive for many months on orbit.
Any Red Bull out there?
I didn't have any, but I drank a lot of tea.
Do they
The
make
Russian
powder,
tea.
do they make it in powdered form?
Yeah, and the Russian coffee was pretty strong, but yeah, there's caffeine up there. By the way, you made the comment about the space potty failing was no big deal. Hey, that's a big deal. And,
No, I didn't say it wasn't a big deal. I said it was a huge deal. And I got firsthand knowledge from Garrett. I was really disappointed that he wasn't able to share that
They said
story.
it wasn't a huge
No,
deal.
it was a huge deal.
Yeah.
And
Well,
it
when I was
does-
up there, we didn't have a backup system. There was one.
Yes, sir. I
But
realize that.
the shuttle potty on the early flights, out of my 4 flights, I think we had 3 of them had potty problems.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nothing like putting your arm in a rubber glove and going through and trying to solve the problem.
Yeah.
I think in that respect, we were pretty lucky at the end of the shuttle program. We had it good,
Yeah.
and the key is also to go up with a Japanese astronaut and an Italian astronaut. I had a Japanese astronaut on the first flight and an Italian on the second flight, and the food was great.
I thought you had something to do with the potty.
Okay, right here.
You mentioned the importance of flight testing. Could you elaborate a little bit on any instances where flight testing, software or hardware, instead of flight testing for your training, was beneficial to some of the experiences and programs that you guys worked on?
So the question is, elaborate on some of the benefits specific to projects of the flight testing that was performed.
Well, I'd say the flight test that Kripp and John Young did on STS-1 helped me a lot.
Well, testing, when I knew when you were doing airplanes, you get to you test them with many hundreds of hours. We couldn't afford to do that on the shuttle. One of the testing things, it wasn't flight testing. I see a couple of people that worked Marshall and engines and that kind of stuff here. One of the things that amazed me was at the end of the shuttle program, we had never lost a main engine except on one flight, and that was due to instrumentation. And knowing before we flew how many of them blew up in a disastrous way, the fact that we ended up going through the program and not having one fail and having to do an RTLS or TAL or one of those was amazing. And it was due to the ground testing that we did to ensure that they were going to be safe.
And I think that the same applies to the software. They had a SAIL, Shuttle Avionics Integrated Laboratory, where they ran the software over and over and did every possible thing they could, and that every time they did a new release. And so by the time it got onto the vehicle and got launched, it was really wrung out well, and that gave me a lot of confidence getting on the vehicle that it was going to work the way it was designed to work.
And when we worked for Dan, we couldn't get assigned to a flight unless we pulled a lot of midnight shifts in SAIL working through the software.
Okay, let's take one more and then we can wrap it up. So,
How did your families respond every time you went up into space? Were they excited, nervous, all of the above, getting the promise not to go again?
the question is, how do your families
my
feel about you
my wife
going
had
to
put up
space?
with me being a test pilot and flying off of carriers in Vietnam, and she was, pretty acceptable of that since I wanted to do it. And my daughter, who was 7, I think, or 6 or 7 when I launched the first time, everybody always talked about launching, and nobody ever talked about coming back. And she was on top of the VAB with the families when they launched, and she just broke down and cried like crazy. And fortunately, Rick Hauk, who'd flying the mission before and was, friends of the family and stuff, he came up and said, "See, I came back," and so that kind of settled that. I think also after the Challenger accident, even though everyone knew there was a risk there, the reality was a little bit more, and it was more stressful. I know for my family after the Challenger accident. After my 4th flight, my wife told me I had to grow up and get a real job.
Yeah, I think I'm the only guy that flew after Columbia, and I had not flown yet. And that Saturday morning just happened to be one of those mornings where I rounded up the kids, and they were all single digits. to sit on the couch, enjoy breakfast, and watch the 107 landing. And so it was my wife had put up with test flying and the Persian Gulf War and a few other things, but convincing the kids as they got older, and I had a conversation with each one of them about it. But it was a challenge. But I think we shared how the shuttle program had gotten so much safer during the return to flight period of time, as well as the importance of doing space missions. But it wasn't an easy discussion.
I had similar experiences in my career prior to that, and at NASA. And my wife actually is a licensed pilot, so it helped her to a certain extent. But with the kids, it was a little more explaining that was necessary. But I think the families understood that there were risks, just as they had when we were flying off of carriers. But the one thing they did have was a support structure between the various families, and that evolved and matured over the years, particularly after Challenger, and really swung into action during Columbia, where the families helped each other deal with anxiety, deal with child care during visits with the crew in quarantine, deal with incidents that occurred during training. They really did back each other up, almost like a military squadron that would pull together in times like that or during deployments. And it was different than the military, but it was similar in that they really did support each other and lean on each other, and I think that helped them get through it. And for those of us that flew in the early days of station, it was a little different because we were going off on a long deployment. Now NASA helped us prepare for that by spending a lot of time in Russia before we launched. And so we were already been gone a lot, and it's like, is that my dad? And and they were always happy when you came back. And there were several instances where kids thought their dad was leaving or mom was leaving in the shuttle and not coming back, and had to have that explained shortly after launch. During STS-51, we actually had 4 attempts to get off the pad, and during the third one, like some of these others, we had a shutdown on the pad at 3 seconds, and the families are about 3.5 miles away on top of the LCC, and watching the countdown. They'd watched several countdowns already, and this time we did get to engine ignition. You've got the water deluge, you've got the steam coming up. It's very dramatic to see all of that. And then they heard the call that we had scrubbed, but they can't see the shuttle. And so they said, okay, they're not going. And they all kind of relaxed and are looking at each other. And about 15 seconds later, they got hit with this blast of sound. And were surprised, totally startled by it, because the engine noise took that long to get to the LCC. And the kids started crying and screaming, and it took all the astronaut escorts to calm everybody down. So they are on edge when you're launching, and it doesn't take much to get them going. But they are very brave people to allow us to go do the fun things we do. And I've always appreciated what my family has done to support me.
Outstanding. So I'd like to wrap this up. First, I jotted just a couple of themes that seemed like they bounced around, and I heard a couple times, and just food for thought to wrap this, put a bow on it. I heard a lot of time talked about communication skills being key in contingency situations, being able to accurately, quickly kind of capture what's going on. The idea that rehearsals don't always match the real thing. I thought that was interesting. It's a risky business. Contingencies happen. Plan for it. Expect it, both during development and ops. And then the last one, as-built drawings, CM is important, make the drawings match the hardware. So things that at least I noted as not being what I'd expect to hear. And a thought for next year, having a station contingency panel. So with that, really want to thank the Astronaut Scholarship Foundation for pulling this together. I want to thank Bob, Dan, Greg, and Frank for taking their time and sharing their experiences and their stories and creating what I think was an amazing time. So thank you very much, gentlemen. Well done, guys. Okay. Thank you, Tony. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Can I ask you a favor?